watcher behind the door. I have always had this strange relationship with closed spaces, with doors that should remain shut, with hinges that creak too loud in houses that are too quiet. There's something about a door left slightly ajar that unsettles me more than one flung open or tightly locked. An open door invites, a locked door protects, but a door left half open, it suggests something waiting just beyond, peering through that narrow slit of shadow, breathing when you're not listening. The house I lived in for a short while wasn't remarkable in any way. The wallpaper peeled in the corners, the wooden floors carried the dull patter of shoes worn thin, and the air always seemed faintly damp, like a cellar after a rainstorm. The place was cheap, affordable, and temporary, or at least that's what I told myself when I signed the lease. But there was one detail that clung to me from the very first night: the door at the end of the hallway. It wasn't locked. It wasn't barred. It was simply there, a pale wooden door with a brass handle that always seemed to glint faintly even in total darkness. No matter how I tried, I could never get it to shut completely. It would swing back, resting in that almost closed position, leaving a slim wedge of blackness between frame and wood. A crack, narrow enough to convince me it was nothing, wide enough to convince me I should be afraid. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Old houses have quirks. Drafts slide through the walls, floorboards shift with the temperature. I told myself the door's resistance was nothing more than a warped frame, swollen wood that refused to cooperate. Yet every time I passed by it, that tiny sliver of shadow seemed to expand, demanding attention. I found myself staring too long at it, my mind inventing the subtle outline of a figure standing just beyond, waiting in silence. Nights in that house were thick with sound. The walls sighed as though they remembered voices that no longer lived within them. Pipes moaned, water ticked through unseen veins, and the floor groaned under its own weight. But there was always another sound, a quieter one, a presence so subtle I often convinced myself I was imagining it. It was the sound of breathing. Not the shallow rhythm of my own chest, but something slower, something deliberate. The kind of breathing that one does when listening carefully, when trying not to be noticed. It seemed to seep through the crack of that door, too faint to pinpoint, but always there if I stood in the hallway long enough. I began to notice changes in the air. The hallway near that door was colder than the rest of the house, even when the heater hummed through the night. A faint smell lingered there too, something metallic, something like wet iron and dust. It wasn't overwhelming, but it clung to the back of my throat, subtle enough that I couldn't forget it. One night, while lying awake, I swore I heard the handle move. It wasn't loud, just the tiniest scrape of metal shifting, a weight testing the mechanism. I froze, every part of me tightening in instinctive dread. The sound stopped, but the silence after was worse, because silence always feels heavier when you're waiting for it to break. I told myself I would fix the door. Maybe nail it shut, maybe wedge something beneath it. But each morning, when daylight softened the edges of fear, I convinced myself it wasn't worth the trouble. And yet, by evening, as the sun dropped and the house filled with shadows, the door would return to its original state, slightly open, slightly breathing. Days blurred into nights, and I began to notice something more disturbing. The door didn't just stay ajar. It moved. The crack would be wider on some nights, narrower on others, though I never touched it. Sometimes I'd pass it in the dim light and swear the gap was wide enough to show the faintest outline of the dark interior beyond. Other times, it was almost sealed, just a hairline of blackness daring me to look closer. What unsettled me most wasn't just the inconsistency, it was the feeling that it changed in response to me. On nights when I felt stronger, braver, the gap seemed smaller. On nights when dread gnawed at me, when I walked the hall too quickly, it would be wide enough to suggest someone could slip through. I began avoiding the hallway altogether. I'd rush past it, never turning my head, never letting my eyes adjust to the shapes in the dark. But avoidance only strengthened whatever lived in that space, because it wasn't long before the presence began to seep into other parts of the house. Shadows clung longer in the corners, the faint smell of iron drifted into my room, and that slow, deliberate breathing seemed to echo against my walls at night. Sleep became fractured. I'd wake at odd hours, heart hammering, certain I wasn't alone. My eyes would adjust to the darkness, and though the room was empty, I'd feel it, the sense of being observed, studied, measured. I couldn't shake the conviction that when I closed my eyes, the distance between me and that door shrank. One night, I gathered what little courage I had and approached the door with a flashlight. The beam cut across the hallway, illuminating dust drifting lazily in the air. The crack in the door was wide enough now to reveal a sliver of blackness, so deep it seemed endless. I raised the flashlight, intending to push the door open, to prove to myself that nothing was there. But the light didn't penetrate. It simply stopped, swallowed by the void, as though the space behind the door refused illumination. My chest tightened. I felt that breathing again, slow, patient, hungry. My hand trembled on the knob, but before I could act, I heard it. A sound so quiet it might have been imagined, yet so sharp it cut through me. A whisper, not a word I could understand, but the shape of breath forming intent. It pressed against my ear even though the door was several feet away, intimate and invasive, as though something was already beside me. I dropped the flashlight. The clatter broke the spell, and I fled, locking myself in my room. But locking doors didn't matter in that house. Not when the thing watching me had no need for locks. From that night on, I stopped checking the hallway. I never dared to measure the crack again, never dared to confirm how wide it had become. But I didn't need to, because the last time I woke in the dead of night, the last time I forced myself to open my eyes, I saw it. Not fully, not clearly, just the faintest curve of a door resting wider than it had ever been before. And within that widening gap, a shape leaned through. A shadow darker than the dark, bending impossibly to fit through a space it shouldn't have been able to occupy. I didn't wait to see more. I closed my eyes, pressing them shut until tears burned against my skin. I tried not to breathe, tried not to exist. And in the suffocating silence of that moment, I felt it, hot and deliberate, breathing with me in rhythm. The watcher had stepped closer. And I realized then, with a kind of sick clarity, that the door had never been about keeping something out. It had always been about letting something in. Ashes beneath the bed. I never liked staying in places that held too much silence. Silence has weight, and when it presses down on a house, it begins to feel like more than emptiness. It becomes a presence. The house I moved into wasn't large, just a modest two-story with faded wallpaper and carpets that seemed permanently stained by the footprints of strangers who had lived there before me. It wasn't much, but it was affordable, and I told myself I would get used to its stillness. But there was something in the bedroom from the very beginning. The room itself seemed ordinary enough, an aging frame bed, a cracked dresser, curtains that had yellowed with time. Yet the first night I tried to sleep there, I smelled it. That faint, bitter tang of burned wood and scorched fabric. It wasn't sharp like smoke curling in the air, but deeper, heavier, like ashes that had settled for years and never been fully swept away. I thought maybe it was just the old structure, maybe some memory of a fire that had once touched this place. Still, it unnerved me because the smell was strongest near the bed. When I leaned over, pressing my face closer to the floorboards, the scent thickened. Something dry, metallic, almost sweet, clung at the back of my throat. I didn't dare look under the bed that first night. The air alone was enough to convince me there was something hidden in the shadows there, something best left undisturbed. Sleep did not come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard faint sounds. Not the familiar creaks of wood or distant hums of plumbing, but softer things. A light hiss, as though something fragile was crumbling just out of sight. A faint scratch, dry and irregular, like brittle fingers dragging across the floorboards. In the morning, it was easier to dismiss. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, and the bedroom looked small, harmless. Yet the smell lingered. Even with the windows open, even with air moving freely through the room, that faint ash scent remained as if it had soaked into the wood itself. Days blurred into nights, and the bedroom grew heavier. Lying there, I would feel the weight of the mattress shift slightly, as if something stirred beneath. My skin prickled with each tiny movement of air, each creak that came not from the house, but from the hollow beneath my body. The smell grew sharper at night too, clinging so strongly I swore I could taste the grit of ash on my tongue. Curiosity gnawed at me. I told myself I needed to look, to face whatever was causing it. But each time I leaned close to the edge of the bed, peering down into the dark slit of space beneath, my chest would tighten. It felt like leaning over the mouth of a well, bottomless, patient waiting. One night, the sound changed. I had grown accustomed to the faint hissing and scratching, but this time it was heavier, like something dragging slowly across the floor. The bed trembled beneath me, so faintly I almost convinced myself it was my own heartbeat making the frame vibrate. But then I smelled it stronger than ever, the ash, the faint char of burned flesh. It filled my lungs until breathing felt impossible. I couldn't help myself. I slipped down onto the floor, knees pressing against the worn carpet, and tilted my head to look. The flashlight in my hand trembled, but I pushed the beam beneath the bed. At first, I saw only dust, thick layers, undisturbed for years, floating like gray snow in the narrow light. But then the beam touched something darker. A stain pressed into the wood, charred, uneven, spreading outward like black veins. The smell hit me with such force that I gagged, while rising in my throat. And then I saw the shapes. Small clumps scattered among the dust, gray and brittle, fragile as paper. I knew what they were before my mind wanted to accept it. Ashes. Not from wood, not from fabric, but from something else. Something human. The air beneath the bed seemed to stir. Dust lifted, swirled, as though disturbed by a breath that was not my own. My flashlight flickered. For a brief instant, I thought I saw the outline of something curled there, something hunched and blackened, its surface cracked like burned skin, its limbs folded too tightly against its body. And then the beam died, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled back, nearly tripping as I threw myself onto the mattress, heart slamming. I stayed there, shaking, as the silence pressed closer. But the silence didn't last. That night, I felt the weight beneath me rise. The bed lifted ever so slightly, as if something had shifted against the floorboards, pressing upward. My breath caught as I realized I was no longer alone in that room. There was no sound, but I felt it, something restless, something that had woken because I had looked. From then on, the nights became unbearable. The smell of ash was constant, so strong it clung to my clothes and followed me out of the house. When I tried to sleep, I felt heat radiating upward, faint at first, then stronger, as though embers glowed beneath the mattress. The sounds grew clearer too. Whispers like dry leaves stirred beneath my bed frame, a dragging shuffle circling. Sometimes, I swore I could hear something scratching at the underside of the mattress, just inches below where I lay frozen in place. I stopped using the bed after that. I tried sleeping on the couch downstairs, but even there, the smell crept into my lungs, the taste of ash coating my mouth until I could hardly stand it. No matter where I went, I could feel that room above me, waiting, something still shifting in the hollow beneath the frame. The final night I spent there is carved into me. I couldn't sleep. The air was too heavy, too thick. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling when I heard it, heavy footsteps above, pacing back and forth in the bedroom. The floor groaned, boards creaked, and then silence. And then a new sound, the faint crumble of ash falling. Not upstairs, not above me, but here, in the living room, on the couch where I lay frozen. I turned my head, and in the dim light of the street lamp seeping through the window, I saw it. Ash drifting gently from the ceiling, sprinkling down in a fine gray rain. I followed it with my eyes, and my stomach knotted as I realized it was falling from the underside of the couch, from beneath me. The heat surged up through the cushions, blistering, suffocating. I didn't wait to see more. I bolted from the house, lungs filled with that bitter taste, the air behind me thick with the hiss of something moving where I had just lain. I never went back. I left everything inside, even the things I couldn't afford to lose. Better to abandon them than to sleep another night above those ashes. But even now, long after I've left that place, the smell hasn't left me. It clings to me when I wake in the middle of the night. That faint char, that bitter smoke curling against my throat. Sometimes I lie there, too afraid to move, certain I'll hear it again, that brittle, restless shifting. And sometimes I swear I feel the mattress rise beneath me, just enough to remind me it never really stayed in that house.